Hi, it's Joe at Red's Fly Shop here. I'm fishing a public water spring creek with some giant rainbows in it. Not far from my house, about an hour away. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, you'll know exactly where it is. If you don't know and you live in the Northwest, just look in the video description and you'll see the name of the destination here. Hey, I'm fishing with one of my sons today. We're not doing a full, video shoot where we film all the fish and etc. But I do have a couple of takeaways as our day nears its end. Teaching my son how to fool these finicky spring creek trout today, and I want to share two things. First is going to be my setup, and then second is why a rod that's a little toned back action-wise is an enormous advantage on a spring creek, which he figured out really quick. As we traded rods, I realized the Winston was winding up in his hands more often than it was mine. But let's start with my setup. Now, on spring creeks, these fish are very selective typically, especially this one. There's lots of fishing pressure. Really fishing small bugs and matching the hatch is important. And although I would like to tell you we could fish dries all the time, there's a lot of fishing pressure here. And so the fish get trained off of the dries pretty quickly. And so we're fishing subsurface most of the time. Now there are scuds and midge and mayflies and a few caddis and etc. But we fish subsurface a good portion of the time, and it's got to be delicate ultralight rigs. In fact, this is a fast section you're seeing behind me here. So holding drifts in very, very slow water is very challenging. And this is very similar to other setups that I have, but let me start just kind of with the main leader. So if I were starting from scratch, I would suggest a 9-foot 4X or 5X leader, and you can just loop to loop that onto your fly line. And the leader is going to wind up at about, let's say 10 to 12 feet, sometimes even longer, depending on what we're doing. And then down at the end of that finely tapered leader, I tie in just with an overhand knot a little tiny tuft of yarn there. And you can use New Zealand indicator yarn. You could use wool out of a barbed wire fence if there's a herd of sheep nearby. That's what the New Zealanders do. But right at the end of that 4 or 5X taper, I tie that yarn in with just a couple of inches. And then we'll see if we can get it in focus, but I've got a 2mm trout tippet ring right there. And I really like to run a tippet ring when I'm dealing with ultralight tippet. And then below that, anywhere from 6 inches to maybe 3 feet, depending on the depth. Oh, there's a big fish just fed up there. Today I'm happy to be running just a few feet of 5X and just this little itty bitty zebra midge, which we'll attempt to get in focus for you. But just that little zebra midge, that's a great go-to pattern right there. You could fish lots of different things. I think a zebra midge for me is a real go-to. This one is tungsten, so it holds itself in the current really well. There are times I need an unweighted or a lightly weighted fly, but tungsten hanging suspended under that indicator really has a lot of stability, and I find that selective trout really like that. But to me, that tippet ring system works really well. I'm going to change flies enough throughout the day. I'm going to break off. I'm going to hang my back cast up, what have you. And that's always an opportunity for me to adjust depth or things like that. And I'm only using just a little bit of tippet at a time. But this system works really, really well for me in these delicate situations. You want the smallest indicator that you can see or will suspend your fly. So that system for me works really, really, really well. So when it comes to fishing these delicate spring creeks, generally we want an upstream presentation, and I'm going to walk upstream. And I'm just trying to set that system down as lightly and delicately as I possibly can. So one little tip with that is if I aim high in the air, I can let everything unfurl. So I'm going to go ahead and cast, and I'm going to aim at an area that's basically like 10 feet above the river, so everything falls very delicately right there. And I'm just letting this float delicately back to me. There's not really any mending required in this kind of fishing. You should be casting at angles and choosing places to stand that give you an optimal drift without mending. So it's a lot like dry fly fishing, and I'm just going to set this down as soft as I can. And that's pretty good cast. We're still casting 30, 40 feet a lot of the time. Just let it drift right back to me. We pounded this water already, so I would be shocked if I catch a fish, by the way. So let me cast again here. And we're going to go a little closer to the big boulder this time. Here we go. There's a fish. Got him. Nice. All right. So on that fish, there was no mend required at all. It's just set that thing down soft, let it land delicately, we've caught a ton like this one today. My son lost about a 7-pounder a while ago, so I relegated him to camera duty. But let's go ahead and net this guy on that rig. Nice. On that little zebra midge that we showed you. Oh, he's already unhooked. How great is that? Cool, let's let him go. So we want to set the rig down really, really soft. It's not a mending thing. There's not really any mending. If you have to mend, you're probably just going to make a lot of disturbance on the surface when it comes to mending. Now, when it comes to the rod and line setup, we've got several rods with us today, as I mentioned. But one thing we noticed right off the bat was like this Pure 2, and it's true of other rods too. I just happen to have a real sweet tooth for this one, is when we get these long leaders. Somebody's got their dog going crazy there. So when we get these long leaders, I may only have a few feet of fly line out. And so when I only have a couple of feet of fly line out, it becomes very hard to load the rod if the rod's a really powerful, extremely fast action rod with a really strong tip. So with a say 13-foot leader, in order to make a cast like that right there, I've only got a few feet of fly line. And we found really quickly that some of the other rods we had, the other fast action rods we had, were much more difficult to cast with those long leaders with only a couple of feet of fly line out. So that's a really good example why this rod in particular really performs well with those long leaders, and that people choose to buy rods with a softer, more moderate action. It's not just because they feel good, but they actually do a lot of the little fishy stuff. They feed line really well. In the event I have to downstream approach, I can feed line with a more flexible rod with a little less disturbance on the water. And they really cast well with just a couple of feet of fly line out the rod tip. They'll still get the distance I need. You know, we're not casting over 40 feet here. That would be a really long cast for us. The other thing too is some of the fish that we are hooking are very large. We do need a rod with enough bottom end that we can actually control those fish and get them landed, but we want the real soft, flexible tip for those casts I was describing, and also for setting the hook and playing fish on really small hooks and light line. So it's a real nod to like this rod, but any rod with a more moderate action. There are really, really specific circumstances where we find it to be a big advantage. So if you find yourself on places that look like this, fishing this kind of system or this kind of setup, maybe avoid buying that ultra high performance fast action rod and get something that will do a lot of that little almost intangible fishy stuff a little bit better for you.